They called it theft. The Volkai used a more elegant term, reclamation of unregistered cognitive assets. But the human sitting across the 16-sided council table from them had spent enough years in patent law to know what the word meant when you stripped the bureaucratic varnish off it. His name was Marcus Dre. He was 43 years old and he had not slept in 31 hours. His left hand rested flat on the table. His right hand held a ceramic mug of coffee that had gone cold somewhere over the North Atlantic on the shuttle up to Helix Station, and he had not put it down since. Not because he needed the caffeine, because the warmth had left it slowly, and the slow leaving of warmth was one of the few things on this station that felt familiar. He was smiling when the council convened. It was a small smile, polite, professional. The kind of smile a man wears when he is the only human in a room containing 41 aliens, and he has decided that fear is a language he refuses to speak today. The presiding chair of the Galactic Intellectual Commons Committee, a Volkai named Sundre, whose secondary sensory clusters vibrated like moth wings behind her primary skull, opened the session with a sound like water running over gravel. The translation implant behind Marcus's left ear rendered it as, "This tribunal is convened regarding the unlicensed propagation of JIC-registered cognitive architecture, designation 7 Theta Rhombus, herein referred to as the device. The human party is present. The record will note his name. Marcus Dre," Marcus said, "United Earth Patent and Sovereign Innovation Office. I represent the inventors." "There are no inventors," said Sundre. "There are licensees. There are registrants. There is a species of origin notation. But the device now falls under Galactic Common Architecture, subsection 9F, which supersedes all primary creator claims once a technology achieves what we define as category threshold." Marcus took a slow breath through his nose. "Right," he said, "and what is category threshold?" A drained delegate, long-limbed, pale as chalk, its joints bending in directions that still made Marcus's own joints ache in sympathy, answered without looking at him. "The point at which a technology is no longer contained to one species' affective sphere and becomes, by nature of its propagation, a common resource of the galactic community." Marcus set his cold mug down. "And who decides when that threshold is crossed?" "The committee. And the committee is composed of member species of the Galactic Intellectual Commons. And are humans members of the Galactic Intellectual Commons?" A pause, not a long one, but Marcus had built an entire career on the weight of pauses, and this one was heavy enough to leave a mark on the floor. "Humans," said Sundre, "are applicants." Marcus nodded slowly. He picked his coffee mug back up. The smile stayed on his face. He had been 26 when Alina Vasquez first showed him the device. She had not called it that, she had called it the cohesion array, but the name that stuck was the one the xenotech journalists used after the first demonstration, and the name that stuck had a weight to it that the original never quite did. The device. Simple. Definitive. Like naming a child something that tells you exactly who they'll become. It was, at its core, a means of storing and transmitting memory as data without neurological degradation. Not consciousness upload. Alina had been furious about that mischaracterization, had written 3 separate opinion papers correcting the record, had once left a conference early rather than listen to a keynote that called it that. It was not consciousness upload. It was the precise, lossless encoding of experiential memory into a format that could be stored, transmitted, experienced by another mind, and then dissolved back into pure data without leaving residue. Like music. Like a song that plays in full and then ends, leaving the listener changed but not damaged, with no ghost of foreign personality rattling around in the architecture of their thoughts. Alina had been 41 when she built the first working prototype. She had used her own memories as test data. The first memory she encoded was of her mother teaching her to braid hair, sitting on the edge of a yellow bedspread Tuesday afternoon light coming through a window in Monterey, the smell of coconut oil, and the sound of cumbia coming from the kitchen 2 rooms over. The memory ran for 6 minutes and 42 seconds. It was the most beautiful data set Marcus had ever reviewed, and he had reviewed it exactly once, in the 3rd year of the patent process, sitting in a conference room with a headset on and his hands in his lap, and he had cried without knowing he was going to cry, and he had felt faintly embarrassed about it, and then he had decided that feeling embarrassed about it was the wrong response. That was a memory worth protecting. They had filed the patent when Alina's array was still a garage lab prototype, running off equipment she had half built and half borrowed from the university. The filing had taken 14 months. The Galactic Intellectual Commons had been in formal diplomatic contact with Earth for 2 years by then, and the United Earth Patent Office had just issued its first cross-species filing guidelines, and no one on Earth really knew what those guidelines meant in practice because no one had tested them yet. Marcus had been the first human attorney to file a cross-species patent. He had not fully understood what he was walking into. The Volkai had been filing patents for 600 years, the Drain for 900. The Sci-Fi Collective, who occupied 4 seats on the committee and had sent 3 representatives to this tribunal, one of whom was now examining Marcus with an expression that he had learned, over 18 months of cross-species diplomatic contact, to identify as contemptuous, had been managing galactic intellectual property law since before Copernicus had decided the sun did not, in fact, revolve around the Earth. Marcus was not naive about what this meant. He had read the committee's filing histories. He had read the Galactic Intellectual Commons Charter, all 940 pages of it, in the original Volkai script and in the 3 available human translations, none of which fully agreed with one another. He had identified 37 specific clauses that could be weaponized against a newly filing species. He had written a 90-page brief about those clauses, most of which he had sent to Alina, and which she had read carefully and then called him and said, "So what do we do about it?" And he had said, "We file anyway, and we do it right." And they had. The patent had been accepted. It had taken 4 years, more negotiations than Marcus could count, and a formal objection process that had consumed something like 3,000 hours of his life. But the patent had been accepted, and the device, the cohesion array, Alina's life's work, had been registered under Human Sovereign Innovation Protection for a term of 60 galactic standard years. That had been 11 years ago. Sundre was speaking again. The committee's advocate, a Volkai legal specialist named Orcs whose sensory clusters moved with a kind of deliberate theatrical slowness when he was making a point, was presenting the case. It was being presented, Marcus had noted, not to him but to the other committee members, who already knew what it said, because this was not a trial so much as it was a formality. The decision had been made before he walked in. That was the thing about being an applicant rather than a member. You were invited to tribunals as a courtesy. Your presence was noted in the record. Your arguments were entertained in the spirit of the Charter's provisions for species of application participation. And then the committee voted, and the vote was weighted by membership tier, and humans, as applicants, had no vote at all. Marcus knew all of this. He had known it before he boarded the shuttle. He had not told Alina everything he knew before he boarded the shuttle, because Alina had enough weight on her already, and because there were some fights you walked into knowing the outcome and walked into anyway because the walking in was itself the point. Orcs finished his presentation. Sundre turned to Marcus. "The human party may respond." Marcus stood up. He was not a tall man. He was built like someone who had spent too many years at a desk and had recently started running and was not quite sure yet whether it was working. He had dark circles under his eyes and a suit that had been pressed but had not survived the shuttle ride pressed, and there was a small coffee stain on his left cuff that he had noticed somewhere over the Atlantic, and decided there was nothing to be done about it. He reached into his briefcase and put a small device on the table. Not the device, his device. A projector, civilian grade, bought at a station kiosk on the way in. "With the committee's permission," he said, "I'd like to show you something." Sundray gestured her assent. The projector produced a holographic display, simple, blue-tinted, the kind of thing Marcus had used in 100 conference rooms on Earth. It showed a timeline. It began in 2041. The device, Marcus said, was conceived, designed, prototyped, tested, corrected, retested, refined over a period of 9 years, and filed for patent in 2041 by Dr. Elena Vasquez, a human scientist, using human neural architecture as its fundamental design basis. The technology works because of how human memory functions. It encodes to human cognitive structures. It transmits along human neurological frequency bands. It is, at its most basic level, a human technology. It does not merely happen to have been invented by a human. It is of human origin in the same way that a lock is of a locksmith's origin. The tool and the mind that made it are inseparable. He clicked to the next slide. In 2047, the Volkai Cognitive Sciences Collective filed a series of what they described as improvement patents on the device. These improvements included a modified transmission protocol, an expanded storage architecture, and what they called a species-neutral encoding layer. I'd like to address those 3 things. He clicked again. The timeline expanded. The modified transmission protocol was filed using technical specifications drawn directly from Dr. Vasquez's original patent documentation. The filing included 47 instances of language that appears verbatim in the original patent. We identified this in our review and filed a derivative work objection under Charter Section 14, Clause 7. Orcai's sensory clusters were very still. "The objection was denied," said one of the Sci-Fi representatives, whose name Marcus could not pronounce with human vocal anatomy, and who he had been internally calling Counselor 3 for the past 2 hours. "It was denied on the grounds that the Volkai filing represented an advancement rather than a reproduction," Marcus said. "That ruling stands, and I'm not here to relitigate it. What I'm here to address is the reclamation claim, the argument that the device has crossed category threshold and now belongs to the commons." He clicked again. The category threshold definition under Charter Section 22, Clause 4, requires 3 conditions. First, the technology must be in active use by more than 12 registered member species. Second, it must have been deployed in interspecies communication contexts on at least 3 occasions under formal JIC-supervised exchange. Third, and this is the condition I want to focus on, it must have been in the committee's language, organically adopted by non-originating species, organically adopted, not licensed, not purchased, not shared under terms of treaty, organically adopted. He let the phrase sit in the air for a moment. "I would like the committee to explain what organic adoption means when the technology in question has been licensed to every single one of the 12+ species currently using it. Licensed, under terms, with fees paid. Dr. Vasquez and to the United Earth Patent Office." He clicked to a new slide, and the room filled with a cascade of licensing records, time-stamped and notarized and signed by representatives of 8 Volkai research collectives, 4 Drain universities, 2 Sci-Fi government agencies, and 1 consortium of Praith merchants who had licensed the technology to use as a form of cultural archive. None of these entities organically adopted anything. They filed for a license. They paid the license fee. They agreed to the terms. Organic adoption cannot be retroactively claimed over a technology that was, at every stage, available only through formal licensing agreements administered by the original inventor. He turned off the projector. He sat down. He picked up his cold coffee mug. The room was quiet in a way that rooms of aliens were not usually quiet. Usually there was the background noise of biorhythmic breathing and secondary sensory apparatus doing their perpetual low-level scanning work, and the subtle electromagnetic hum that Drain exuded in thought. Now it was quiet in the way a room goes quiet when something has been said that requires a pause before anyone decides how to respond. Soon Dre's sensory clusters moved in a complex pattern that Marcus's translation implant rendered as: "The committee will note the human party's argument for the record. The committee will also note that the Galactic Intellectual Commons Charter is not a human document and is not interpreted by human legal precedent." "That's correct," Marcus said. "Nor is the committee bound to accept human definitions of organic adoption." "That's also correct. Although," Marcus said, "I would note that the term organic adoption appears in the Charter as a direct translation of a Volcae legal concept that the founding species defined in their original 2198 Charter drafting session, and the definition I've been working from is the one provided in the committee's own interpretive guide, 2nd edition, Chapter 11, page 447. If the committee intends to use a different definition than the one published in its own interpretive materials, I'd welcome the clarification." Another pause. This one was longer. He had worked through every version of this conversation over the past 3 weeks. He had built models. He had run simulations. He had talked through scenarios with his assistant, with Alina, with the 2 other human attorneys who had done any work in this area, with a Drain academic named Vostel who had become something close to a friend over the years, and who had warned him, with the careful neutrality of someone who genuinely likes you but cannot be seen to take sides, that the committee's decision was likely already made. He had accounted for every counterargument they could deploy. He had closed every procedural door they might try to walk through. He had not accounted for one thing. He had not accounted for the fact that he was prepared, and they were not. The GIC committee, the Volcae, the Drain, the Sothii, the other 8 species at the table, had been managing galactic IP law for centuries. They had handled 912 reclamation cases in their history. They had never lost one. The precedent was absolute, the process was routine, and the human was an applicant species sitting across the table from 600 years of institutional momentum. They had not expected him to do his homework. Counselor 3, the Sothii representative, was conferring with its 2 colleagues in a rapid subsonic register that Marcus's implant could detect but not translate. The Drain delegate had shifted its posture in the way that Marcus had learned from Vostel's careful coaching meant recalculation. Orcs was very still. Sundre said, "The committee requests a recess." "Of course," Marcus said. He did not move. He sat at the table and drank his cold coffee and waited. The recess lasted 40 minutes. Marcus spent it at the table because the recess room was a small curved space with chairs designed for Volcae anatomy, and he had tried sitting in one on the way in and had decided the indignity was not worth whatever comfort it offered. He sat at the council table and he reread the Charter's section 22 one more time, not because he needed to, but because rereading source documents before a significant moment was a habit built over 20 years of practice, and habits like that were structural. You did not tear out the load-bearing walls. The night before the tribunal, Marcus had been visited in his station quarters by Orcs. He had not been surprised. He had been waiting for it, actually, had felt the visit coming the way you feel weather coming in certain kinds of buildings, a pressure change before the fact. The Volcae legal specialist had knocked, which was a courtesy Marcus appreciated more than he showed, and had entered when invited and stood by the door with the careful posture of someone who has not decided, yet, exactly what they intend to say. The quarters were functional. Everything on Helix Station was functional. There was a desk, a sleep surface, a window looking out toward the moon, and Marcus's briefcase open on the desk with 18 months of documentation, arranged in a precise order that Priya had called terrifying, and that Marcus thought of simply as organized. Orcs looked at the briefcase for a long moment. "You prepared extensively," he said. The implant gave the Volkai inflection a slightly formal cast. Their language had registers like a musical instrument, and formal was the setting you defaulted to when uncertain. "I did," Marcus said. "The committee did not expect it." "I know." Orkai moved further into the room. His sensory clusters were doing the low-level ambient scan that Volkai did constantly, and which Marcus had initially found unsettling, and had eventually come to regard as their version of watching a room, gathering data the way eyes gather light, automatic, unintentional. "You should understand," Orkai said, "that this reclamation was not made in malice." "I know that too," Marcus said. "That's not what makes it wrong." A pause. What makes it wrong in the human party's view? Marcus had thought about how to answer this question. He had thought about it for the entire shuttle ride up and on the flight from Santiago before that, and in the weeks of preparation before the flight. He had a legal answer: the organic adoption standard, the reproducibility exception, the procedural failures in the notification timeline. He had 4 legal answers, all of them good, all of them documented, all of them sitting in exhibits in his briefcase. But Orkai was not asking for the legal answer, not at 2200 hours in a set of functional quarters on Helix Station. He was asking for the other one. "Dr. Vasquez built the device from the inside out," Marcus said. "He built it from memory, literally, from the experience of having memories, from what it feels like to lose one and what it feels like to hold one that you're afraid to lose. Her mother died the year she filed the first patent. She encoded those memories as part of the test run. Not the ones from that year, she couldn't bring herself to do those yet. The ones from before, when her mother was alive and it was a Tuesday afternoon, and the light was coming through a window and there was music from the kitchen." He paused. "The device exists because a human woman was afraid of forgetting. That's not a metaphor. That's the engineering origin story. The fear of forgetting is literally why the architecture is built the way it is, why it prioritizes emotional indexing, why the limbic tagging is so precise, why it works in a way that nothing the Volkai built in 200 years of cognitive tech could quite manage. Because the Volkai built from the outside looking in, and Alina built from the inside looking at what she couldn't afford to lose." He looked at Orkai. "You can take the architecture. You can reclassify it. You can call it commons and distribute it and improve it and build 1,000 variations on it, and in 600 years it will be as much yours as it is hers. But you can't undo the fact that it was made from grief. And a framework that says grief is a common resource the moment enough people find it useful, that framework is wrong. Not legally wrong necessarily, but wrong." Orkai was very still. "The committee," he said after a moment, "does not typically operate on those terms." "I know," Marcus said. "I'm not asking the committee to operate on those terms. I'm asking the committee to look at its own charter carefully enough to find the terms that achieve the same result through the appropriate mechanism, which I believe it has if it looks." Orkai left shortly after. He did not say whether he agreed or disagreed. He did not indicate how he intended to approach the following day's session. Marcus did not ask. He sat at the desk and finished reviewing his notes, and then lay down on the sleep surface without changing out of his clothes, and stared at the ceiling, and listened to the station's ambient hum, and thought about a Tuesday afternoon in Monterey. He slept for 4 hours. He had not slept more than 4 hours at a stretch in 11 days. In the morning he bought the coffee, drank half of it on the way to the council chamber, and walked in with the mug still warm in his hand. His assistant, Priya, messaged him from Earth, "How's it going?" He messaged back, "Having coffee." She sent back a single emoji of a fire, which he took to be either encouragement or a sincere appraisal of the situation, and he was not sure it mattered which. Alina called during the recess. he answered. How is it, she said. They recessed, he said. A beat. He could hear her breathing. She was in her lab in Santiago, which meant it was 3 in the morning there, which meant she had not been sleeping either. Is that good? It's interesting, Marcus said. Alina laughed. It was a short laugh, almost involuntary. You've been saying that for 20 years. This is interesting. Usually right before everything goes sideways. Usually right before I find a way through, Marcus said. I think there's a way through. Marcus. Her voice had a different register in it now. He had known Alina for 17 years, and he had learned the registers. This one was the one she used when she needed to say something she had been holding for a while. If they take it, if they push through the reclamation, it's not the money. You know that. The licensing revenue, the partnership deals, all of that, that's not, she stopped. It's the memory. The one I used for the test. My mother. If they take the device and they reclassify it as Commons architecture, they own the encoding structure that holds that memory. They own the format. My mother's hands in my hair at 3 in the afternoon in Monterey. They don't own the memory, Marcus said. They can't own the memory. They can claim the architecture, but the memory is yours. It's encoded in a format I'm going to argue was never transferred in the license agreements, because the licenses covered deployment rights and not ownership of base cognitive structures. That's the second argument. I haven't gotten to the second argument yet. Another pause. You have a second argument. I have 4. He could hear her sit down. The sound of a lab chair rolling back on tile, somewhere in Santiago at 3 in the morning. Marcus, she said. Yeah. Don't lose. I'm working on it, he said. The committee returned at the 90-minute mark, not the 40. Marcus noted this without expression. Sundre settled back into the presiding chair. Her sensory clusters had a different configuration than before the recess. Marcus had seen this configuration once before, in the early days of the patent filing process, when the initial Volkai examiner had encountered his secondary objection brief and realized it was 60 pages longer than anything a human attorney had filed previously, and had taken a recess to consult with colleagues, and had returned looking exactly like Sundre looked right now. It was the configuration of someone who had been told they were in a more complicated fight than they expected. The committee, Sundre said, has reviewed the human party's argument regarding the organic adoption standard. The committee acknowledges that the licensing records provided do represent a formal transfer of rights rather than an independent development trajectory. However, the committee maintains that. I appreciate that, Marcus said. He was still sitting. His voice was even, clear, not aggressive. Before the committee continues, I'd like to introduce the second element of the human party's response. Sundre paused. The floor has not been yielded. I apologize, I'll wait. She continued. The committee maintains that the organic adoption standard is met in cases where technological proliferation has reached a level at which removal of the originating license would not meaningfully impede ongoing use. In other words, where the technology has become so integrated into interspecies practice that the originating patent becomes, in practical terms, moot. The committee cites precedent from the Drain case of 2367, the Sothii Cognitive Archive matter of 2441, and the Volkai Neural Mapping dispute of 2589, Marcus said. Sundre stopped. I was going to say that one, she said. I know, Marcus said. I wanted to confirm I've read it. In the Volkai Neural Mapping dispute of 2589, the committee ruled that a Praith-originated memory transmission technology had crossed category threshold on the grounds that 17 species were actively using it, and that the Praith licensing framework had effectively dissolved due to the Praith political fragmentation of 2580. I want to highlight 2 distinctions. First, the Praith political fragmentation meant that there was no functioning licensing authority capable of enforcing the original patent terms. The licensing authority for the cohesion array, the United Earth Patent and Sovereign Innovation Office, is fully functional, staffed, and prepared to enforce. Second, and I think this is the more significant distinction, he paused here, not for effect, though it had the effect of being for effect, but because he was watching Orcs, and Orcs' stillness had taken on a quality that Marcus had learned to read as extreme attention. In the 2589 case, the Praith technology was independently reconstructible, meaning that the 17 species using it had, at various points, developed their own versions of the core architecture that did not depend on the original Praith IP. The committee ruled it was commons because it was effectively already commons. The original had dissolved and been rebuilt by others independently. He leaned forward slightly. The cohesion array cannot be independently reconstructed by any non-human species, not because of deliberate obfuscation on Dr. Vasquez's part, she published. She shared, she lectured, she collaborated, but because the encoding architecture is built on human neurological structures and the specific way that human memory forms, the particular interaction of hippocampal indexing, limbic emotional tagging, and prefrontal narrative assembly that makes human memory what it is not replicable from the outside. The Volkai improvement patents changed the transmission protocol. They did not change the encoding layer. They could not change the encoding layer because they don't fully understand it, because the encoding layer requires an intuitive grasp of how human memory actually feels from the inside, and that is not a thing you can study from the outside and replicate. Every species using this technology today is using it because they licensed it from Dr. Vasquez, and every species using it today would lose access to it if the licensing structure dissolved, because none of them can rebuild it independently. He sat back. The 2589 precedent does not apply. The room was quiet again. It was a different quiet than before. The first quiet had been the quiet of surprise. This quiet was something else. It was the quiet of people recalibrating. Counselor 3 spoke. Marcus's implant rendered the Sothii vocalization as, "The human claims exclusive technical knowledge of the originating architecture as a basis for rejecting commons reclassification. Can the human party substantiate this claim?" "Yes," Marcus said. "I have 3 independent technical assessments, 2 from human institutions and 1 from the Drain Institute of Applied Cognitive Engineering, which I note is a JIC-affiliated body, confirming that the base encoding layer of the cohesion array cannot be reproduced from the existing patent documentation alone and requires, in the Drain assessments, language, intimate familiarity with the originating species' neurological phenomenology. The assessments are Exhibits 7, 8, and 9 in the materials I provided to the committee 30 days ago." Another pause, longer. The Drain delegate was consulting a data surface. Marcus watched it scroll through the exhibits and find Exhibit 8, the Drain Institute assessment, and read it, or whatever the Drain equivalent of reading was. The committee, Sundre said, was not anticipating the depth of this response. It was a remarkable thing to say in a formal tribunal. It was also, Marcus thought, honest in a way that made him feel something he was careful not to let reach his face. Not triumph, something quieter than triumph, the feeling of having done the work correctly. "I've been preparing for 18 months, he said. "Dr. Vasquez has been preparing for longer." Orcs spoke for the first time since the recess. His sensory clusters moved with a deliberateness that the translation implant rendered, after a moment's processing, as, "The human party has presented a substantive challenge to the reclamation basis. The committee will need to review the presented materials in full before proceeding." "I understand," Marcus said. I'd ask that the review include the third and fourth elements of the human party's response, which are in Exhibits 10 through 14, and address the prior notification requirements under Section 22 and the treaty obligations that Earth entered under the GIC application framework. I'd also ask that the committee consider whether the precedent it's setting in this case would effectively bar all future species of application patent protections, since any technology developed by an applicant species that reaches cross-species adoption could, under the reading the committee has proposed today, be immediately reclaimed before that species achieves member status, creating a framework in which the act of successful innovation is its own disqualification. This landed differently than the previous arguments. Marcus had known it would. The previous arguments were legal. This one was political. And the committee ran on politics, the way engines ran on fuel. And the committee knew, had always known, probably, that the framework it was building in this case was being watched by every applicant species in the GICQ, and that the precedent being set here would echo for centuries, and that the echo might not be entirely to the founding species' benefit. Sundre was very still. The human party, she said slowly, is suggesting that the committee's ruling has implications beyond this case. I'm not suggesting it, Marcus said. I'm stating it as a fact because it does. He waited. And then Counselor 3 said the thing that changed the room. The committee also notes, the Sci-Fi representative said, its three-part vocalization reaching a register that Marcus's implant tagged as dismissive formal, that the human party's emotional attachment to the originating technology, while culturally noted, is not a factor in reclamation proceedings. Species of origin sentiment is not a recognized standing under the Charter. We have observed similar attachments from every species whose technology has been reclaimed. The Praeth were sentimental as well. The Praeth are no longer relevant. It landed in the room like a stone dropped into deep water. The ripple spread in every direction. Even Sundre's sensory clusters shifted, a micro-adjustment, the Volkai equivalent of a wince, because Counselor 3 had just said something that was technically accurate and procedurally appropriate, and also, in the estimation of everyone in the room, deeply unwise. Because Marcus stopped smiling. It was not dramatic. There was no jaw clench, no flash of anger, no theatrics. The small professional smile simply left. It left his face the way a cloud shadow passes off a field, smooth and total and impossible to ignore. And what was underneath was not rage and was not grief and was not defiance, but was instead something that every alien in the room recognized at a level more primal than diplomacy. It was focus. The drained delegate, who had spent the session in postures of academic detachment, went rigid. Orcai's sensory clusters folded flat against his skull, a Volkai stress response that Marcus had never seen in formal chambers. Two of the Sci-Fi representatives turned toward Counselor 3 with a subharmonic vocalization that the implant caught but did not translate, and that Marcus interpreted from 18 months of studying interspecies body language as something close to, "What have you done?" The room held its breath. Marcus looked at Counselor 3 for a long, measured moment. Then he looked at Sundre. Then he looked at the table, at the 16 sides, the 41 seats, the 600 years of accumulated institutional authority. And when he spoke, his voice had not changed in volume or tempo, but it had changed in the way that mattered, the way that a violin's timbre changes when you press the bow harder without moving faster. The Praeth, Marcus said, are an applicant species cautionary tale that this committee should be deeply uncomfortable citing as a model outcome. The Praeth technology was reclaimed. The Praeth then lost the ability to innovate within the GIC framework because every subsequent technology they developed was adopted and reclaimed within a single generation. The Praeth stopped innovating. The Praeth stopped contributing. The Praeth are still in applicant status 400 years later. If Counselor 3 is proposing that humanity follow the Praeth trajectory, I'd ask the committee to consider what happens when 7 other applicant species currently in the GIC queue watch us do it, and decide that innovation within the GIC system is a trap. He paused, not long, just long enough. Because if the message of this tribunal is that the GIC's founding species will appropriate any technology developed by a newcomer the moment it proves valuable, while those newcomers remain locked in applicant status with no vote and no recourse, then the message is not that the GIC is a collaborative institution. The message is that the GIC is a cartel. And cartels, Marcus said, with the quiet precision of a man who has been building toward this sentence for 18 months and who has earned, through preparation, the right to deploy it, eventually meet someone who would rather build outside the system than be consumed by it. Counselor 3's 3 colleagues turned away from Marcus and toward their own representative. The subsonic register was louder now. Even Marcus could feel it, a low vibration in his sternum, like standing too close to a bass speaker. The thing about the smile, the small, flat, professional smile that had been on Marcus's face since the session opened, was that it had not changed through any of the legal arguments, not through the interruptions, not through the first recess, not through the citation of the 2589 precedent. It had been armored, professional, chosen in advance and held in place by discipline. And then it had stopped, and the stopping had been more alarming than anything he had said, because the smile had been a social signal, a declaration of non-threat, and the absence of the smile was a different declaration entirely. He had told Elena, the night before the shuttle, "I'm going to sit across from 600 years of institutional momentum, and I'm going to be polite about it, and I'm not going to give them anything to work with except the arguments, because the arguments are good and the arguments are enough." She had said, "What if they're not?" He had said, "Then we file appeals for 20 years, and we make their lives miserable in ways they didn't know were possible, and eventually they change the rules because it's less painful than dealing with us." She had laughed. He had not been entirely joking. The smile came back, slowly, not the same shape as before, slightly wider, slightly warmer, as if the muscles had reset and come back at a different resting position. Marcus picked up his coffee mug. "I apologize," he said mildly. "I want to be clear that the human party is not making threats. The human party is making observations about institutional incentive structures, which is, I believe, within the scope of this proceeding." Sundre looked at him. Her sensory clusters had settled into a configuration Marcus had not seen before, not alarm, not recalculation, but something the implant took a long time to render, and when it did, the closest word it found was respect. "The committee," she said, "will recess." The committee recessed again. This one lasted 3 hours. Marcus ate a nutrition bar from his briefcase, because he had thought to pack nutrition bars, and read through his notes one more time, and called Priya to update her, and did not call Elena because Elena needed to sleep, and he was not sure he had enough good news yet to justify waking her. He walked to the observation window at the end of the corridor outside the council chamber. Helix Station sat at the L4 point between Earth and the Moon, which meant that from the observation window he could see both. The Moon bone-white and steady, Earth vivid and improbable below it, blue and white and deeply, almost offensively beautiful in the way it always was when you saw it from out here, the way that never quite became routine no matter how many times you made the trip up. He pressed his palm flat against the glass. Not a dramatic gesture, just a thing to do with his hand, which had been holding a mug for most of the day and needed something to push against. He thought about Elena's mother, Tuesday afternoon light, coconut oil, cumbia from the kitchen. He thought about the fact that the first human technology to reach category threshold in the galactic intellectual commons was a technology for holding memories. A technology built from the specific and unreplicable way that human beings encode experience into their neural tissue. The limbic tagging, the hippocampal indexing, the prefrontal narrative assembly, the irreducible personal weight of a moment lived and stored and carried forward. He thought about what it meant to claim that as commons. He had written, in the introduction to his first brief to the committee, 18 months ago, there is a category of human intellectual property that is not primarily economic. There are things we make that are made from the texture of being human, and those things carry a different weight than a manufacturing patent or a communications protocol. We ask the committee to consider whether the frameworks developed for the latter apply without modification to the former. We ask the committee to consider what is lost when a species' fundamental relationship to its own experience is treated as a line item in a resource allocation table. The committee had not responded to that introduction. Introductions were not formally part of the record. He went back in when the session was called to reconvene. Sundre looked. If Marcus was reading Vokai physiological tells correctly, and he had been studying them for a year and a half, with Vostell's coaching and his own obsessive review of every available behavioral analysis, like someone who had made a decision they had not expected to make. The committee, she said, has reviewed the human party's exhibits and the full body of arguments presented. The committee has also consulted, during the recess, with 2 GIC legal scholars regarding the organic adoption standard and its applicability to technologies that remain irreproducible by non-originating species. She paused. The committee finds, she said, that the presented technical evidence, specifically the assessments confirming the non-reproducibility of the base encoding architecture, constitutes a material distinction from the precedents on which the reclamation basis was grounded. The cohesion array, as currently constituted, does not meet the category threshold standard as defined under Charter Section 22, Clause 4, because the threshold requires that a technology be effectively commons in function as well as in use, and a technology that cannot be independently maintained or reproduced by non-originating species cannot be said to have crossed that threshold. The room was quiet. The reclamation claim, Sundre said, is denied. Marcus held his face very still. He did not pump a fist. He did not exhale with visible relief. He did not allow the thing that was happening in his chest, the bright, sudden release of 18 months of work and fear and meticulous preparation, to reach his face. He nodded. "Thank you," he said. "The human party appreciates the committee's thorough review." Orcs said, "The committee will note that this ruling establishes a new standard for technology reclamation in cases involving applicant species origin, which will require a formal interpretive amendment to the Charter." "I understand," Marcus said. "The United Earth Patent Office looks forward to participating in the amendment process as an applicant status partner." There were more things said, procedural things, formal closes, the record noting the ruling. Marcus responded to each one with the same even, measured courtesy he had maintained since the session opened, and at no point in any of it did his expression change from that small, flat, professional calm that he had walked in wearing. It was only after the council chamber had cleared, after Sundre and Orcs, and the drained delegate and Councilor 3, and the other 20-odd committee members had filed out through their various exits, the room emptying in the layered, unhurried way of people who had other business to get to, that Marcus sat alone at the 16-sided table and let out a long, slow breath. He picked up his cold coffee mug. It was empty. He did not remember drinking it. He called Elena. She answered on the second ring. He could hear that she had been awake, or had been asleep, and had been waiting for the call in that state of half-sleep that is not really sleep at all. "Marcus." "Hey," he said. A pause. "Marcus." "We won," he said. He heard her. He heard the exact sound of it, not a word, not a sentence, just the sound that she made, which was the sound of 17 years of work and 9 years of development, and one Tuesday afternoon in Monterey, encoded in a format that now, definitively, belonged to no one but her. He sat in the empty council chamber of the Galactic Intellectual Commons and listened to her cry, and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say, and did not tell her to stop, because she was not going to stop, and did not look at his watch to see what time it was, because it did not matter what time it was. After a while she said, "You okay?" "Yeah," he said, "tired." "Come home." "Tomorrow," he said. "I've got some filings to submit before I leave. The interpretive amendment process. They're going to try to narrow the ruling in the cleanup language, and I need to be on that early." "Marcus." He could hear her settle back into her lab chair, 2-point-something seconds away at the speed of light. "You just won a case against 600 years of institutional momentum. You can file tomorrow." "Tonight," he said. "I'll file tonight and sleep on the shuttle." She was quiet for a moment. "You're going to do this again, aren't you? Some other technology, some other case." "Probably," he said. "There are a lot of applicant species in the GICQ who just watched us establish a precedent. Some of them are going to need help. Help from a human attorney. Help from someone who knows how to read a 900-page charter," Marcus said, "and how to find the 37 clauses that can be turned the other way." She laughed, that full laugh, the real one, not the short, involuntary one. "You told me there were 37 clauses." "There were 39 by the time I finished the second reading," Marcus said. "I rounded down." "Marcus." "Yeah. Thank you." He looked at the 16-sided table, at the seats that had been filled, an hour ago, with 600 years of institutional momentum and the collective certainty of species who had been making these decisions since before humanity had printing presses, let alone patents. At the place where he had sat, alone, with a cold cup of coffee and a 900-page charter and 18 months of homework. "Don't thank me," he said. "The work was good. The work was enough." He filed the first objection letter to the amendment process that night, from a small workstation in Helix Station's human-accessible administrative wing, while the station rotated slowly through its orbit, and the Earth turned below him, and somewhere in Santiago, a scientist with her mother's braiding hands slept, finally, with her work intact. He was halfway through the letter, page 22, a particularly granular section on the interpretive boundaries of species-neutral encoding, as distinguished from species-agnostic deployment, when someone knocked on the workstation door. It was Vostell. The Drain academic was taller than Marcus by a full 1.5 meters, which meant that standing in the doorway of the human-accessible workstation required a particular folding of limbs that looked, to human eyes, uncomfortable, and that Drain physiology accommodated without complaint. Vostell had a way of folding that looked almost elegant, angular, and precise, like origami made from chalk-colored bone. "You are still working," Vostell said. It was not a question. It was the kind of observation that served as a question in Drain conversational structure, a statement of fact that invited a response without demanding one. "Yeah," Marcus said. "The ruling was favorable." "The ruling was the start," Marcus said. "The amendment process is where they'll try to narrow it. I've got about a 6-hour window before the committee's legal staff wakes up and starts drafting their version." Vostell folded further into the room. There was only one chair, and it was human-sized, so Vostell settled into what Marcus had learned to recognize as a Drain standing rest posture. Weight distributed across 3 of its 4 limbs, the 4th folded against its torso, a position roughly analogous to a human leaning against a wall with their arms crossed. "I cannot advise you," Vostell said. "I want to be clear about that." "You've been clear about that for 18 months, Marcus said. "I appreciate it." "What I can do," Vostell said, "is observe." "And my observation," which is personal and not professional, is that the sound Counselor 3 made when you discussed the Praith trajectory was a sound I have not heard a Sci-Fi representative make in formal chambers in the entire duration of my academic career. Marcus looked up from the workstation screen. What kind of sound? The kind that means they will not forget what was said. Sci-Fi do not forget in the way that other species forget. Their memory is less precise but more durable than yours. They will carry the shape of that exchange, the emotional weight of it, for their entire remaining lifespan. You spoke to the room, but you altered Counselor 3 permanently. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Good, he said. It was not a compliment, Vostell said. Or perhaps it was, I have not decided. Marcus almost laughed. Fair. There is another observation I would make, if it is welcome. Go ahead. You spoke tonight in the session about grief, about the device being built from grief. You said this to Orcs privately and then deployed a version of it publicly, in the architecture of your arguments, never directly stated in the formal record, but present in the framing, in the way you described Dr. Vasquez's test data, in the way you structured the reproducibility argument around the personal nature of human memory rather than the technical nature of human neurology. Marcus waited. The Vorkai do not grieve as humans do, Vostell continued. They process loss through a communal resonance structure, a shared sensory field that distributes the emotional weight across their collective. The drain process loss through intellectual categorization. The Sci-Fi do not process it at all, in the way you would understand. They incorporate it into their baseline cognitive state as an ambient condition. But you humans, you carry your grief individually, in the full weight of its original form, for your entire lives. You carry it as a load-bearing element of your identity. And the device, the cohesion array, is a technology that allows you to encode that carried weight so precisely that another mind can experience it without damage. Vostell paused. No other species in the GIC could have built it. Not because they lack the technical capability, because they lack the specific cognitive relationship to memory that makes such a technology necessary. Your grief built the device, and tonight, the committee was forced to acknowledge that what grief builds cannot be claimed by those who have never carried it. The room was quiet for a while. That's a generous reading, Marcus said. It is an accurate reading, Vostell said. Generosity is incidental. Marcus turned back to his screen. Page 22. The distinction between species neutral and species agnostic. The amendment language that would determine whether tonight's ruling held or eroded over the next 3 years of institutional negotiation. Thank you, he said. Vostell unfolded from the standing rest posture and moved toward the door. At the threshold, the drain paused. Marcus. Yeah. The coffee you carry into the sessions. It is always cold by the time the proceedings begin. Usually, yeah. Why do you carry it? Marcus looked at the mug. It was sitting on the workstation desk, empty, ringed with the faint brown stain of 12 hours of intermittent use. It was a plain ceramic mug, white, bought from a kiosk on Earth and carried up in his briefcase because he did not trust the station's dispensers to get the weight right. Because I know what it felt like when it was full, he said. Vostell studied him for a moment. Then the drain folded through the door and was gone, and Marcus turned back to the objection letter, and the station turned, and the Earth turned beneath it. The objection letter ran 44 pages. The committee received it at 600 station time and noted, in their internal communications, which Marcus would not see for 11 years, when the GIC opened its deliberation archives under the Transparency Compact, that the human attorney had, in the 44 pages, identified and addressed 6 potential avenues for narrowing the ruling before the committee's own legal staff had finished identifying them. One of the Drain committee members noted, in a memo to Sundre, that the human had apparently submitted the letter before sleeping. Sundre's reply was brief. The translation from Voakai renders roughly as, "He did not sleep. He never stopped working. We should note that in the record as well. We should note all of it." In the weeks following the ruling, the GIC secure communication channels carried a volume of interspecies diplomatic traffic that the monitoring algorithms flagged as anomalous. The Torshi, a species in their third century of applicant status, whose most significant technological contribution, a biological water purification system, had been reclaimed 40 years prior, submitted a formal inquiry about the ruling's applicability to their own case. The Pelani conjunction, an applicant consortium of 3 species who shared a home system and had been collaborating on a faster-than-light communication relay, requested a copy of Marcus's exhibits. The Drain Institute of Applied Cognitive Engineering published a commentary in their academic journal that discussed the ruling's implications for the organic adoption standard and cited the Cohesion Array Assessment, Exhibit 8, as a case study in why the category threshold framework required fundamental revision. Marcus read the commentary on a data pad during the shuttle ride home. He read it twice. The second time, he underlined a passage that said, in the precise and emotionally restrained language that Drain academics used, the human attorney's argument was not novel in its legal structure, but was novel in its application of existing standards to a context the standards were not designed to accommodate. The result is a precedent that does not expand the law so much as it reveals the law's existing shape more accurately than its authors intended. He smiled at that, the real smile, not the professional one. He landed in Santiago at dusk. Elena was waiting at the shuttle port, which surprised him. She did not usually leave the lab during working hours, and it was working hours for another 90 minutes. She was standing near the pickup zone with her arms crossed and her lab coat still on, which told him she had come straight from the bench. And there was a look on her face that he had seen once before, 17 years ago, when she had shown him the prototype for the first time and said, "This is going to change everything, and help me make sure they can't take it." "You look terrible," she said. "I haven't slept in about 3 days," he said. "You look like you haven't slept in about 3 days. Thank you for the confirmation." She hugged him. It lasted longer than their usual greetings, and when she stepped back she had that expression again, the one from 17 years ago, but it had something in it now that hadn't been there then. He identified it, after a moment, as trust that had survived testing. Not blind trust, not hope, the specific trust of someone who had handed someone else the most important thing they had and watched them carry it through. "The amendment process is going to take years," he said. "I need to be on it." "I know. There are going to be other cases, other species." "I know that too." She handed him a paper cup of coffee. It was from the stand across the street, the one with the yellow awning, the one whose name he could never remember but whose coffee was good enough that he'd been coming there since his first trip to see her in Santiago 11 years ago. It was hot. He wrapped his hand around it and held it the way he'd been holding the mug in the council chamber, not for the caffeine, but for the fact of warmth, the human fact of warmth in the hand. "Come on," she said. "I'll drive you to the hotel. I need to draft the second filing tonight. I'll drive you to the hotel, and you can draft it in the morning." "Elena." "Marcus," she looked at him. "The work will be there in the morning. The work is always there in the morning. That's the whole point of what you just did. You made sure the work will still be there. You protected the future. Now sleep." He looked at the coffee. He looked at her. He looked at the Santiago skyline, which was darkening into purple and orange, and which smelled like exhaust and rain, and the particular mineral tang that cities have at dusk in the southern hemisphere. "Okay," he said. He slept for 14 hours. When he woke up, the coffee on the nightstand was cold, and he drank it anyway, and it tasted like something worth remembering. The amendment process took 3 years. Marcus was present for every session. At the end of it, the Galactic Intellectual Commons Charter had a new clause, Section 22, Clause 4, Subsection G, which established that technologies whose base architecture was irreproducible by non-originating species were exempt from category threshold reclamation, regardless of proliferation level. It was written in Volcae legal language, but the underlying concept had been drafted by a human attorney working from a coffee-stained brief at a small workstation at the L4 point between Earth and the Moon. 4 applicant species cited it within the first 2 years. Marcus was present for those sessions too. He was smiling when he walked in. The same smile. The small, flat, professional one that did not change when they interrupted him, and did not change when they cited precedent, and did not change when the vote seemed foregone, and the outcome seemed settled, and the institutional momentum of 6 centuries was in the room with him. The smile of someone who has done the work and knows the work is good, and has decided, before he needs it, that nothing in the room is going to take that away. He carried his cold coffee mug every time. It was empty most mornings by the time the sessions convened. He bought it full and drank it on the way in and walked into the chambers carrying an empty mug, which none of the alien delegates ever commented on, and which his assistant Priya, when she finally asked him about it, said, "Why do you bring it if it's empty?" And Marcus said, "Because I know what it felt like when it was full." Priya looked at him for a moment. "That's very you," she said. "Yeah," he said. He picked up the mug. He walked in.